Protests in the United States, states in revolt, and a crisis of trust. Over the past few years, the United States has experienced a series of large-scale protest movements that expose deep social, economic, and political fissures in society. Reflecting the contradictions and tensions that span different regions and states, these protests have taken on the character of state insurrections, with individual regions demonstrating serious dissatisfaction with federal governance and national policies. Causes of the protests: a systemic crisis and dissatisfaction with the government. The mass protests are driven by a complex of factors: economic inequality, racial and social injustices, a sense of loss of political influence and freedom, and disagreements about the role of the federal government. Numerous scandals related to police brutality, corruption, and election fraud have undermined trust in government institutions. The COVID-19 pandemic, which has exposed weaknesses in the healthcare system and exacerbated economic problems, has also heightened tensions. Protest forms and geography. Protests have taken many forms, from peaceful demonstrations and strikes to clashes with law enforcement and the occupation of government buildings. The situation is particularly acute in states such as California, Texas, New York, and several southern and Midwestern states, where the political divide between urban and rural areas is at its peak.
Introduction: a nation divided and a threat to integrity. The United States today is a country experiencing a large-scale internal crisis, which manifests itself not only in political polarization, but also in social divisions, state confrontation, and weakening of federal power. Numerous protests in recent years have turned into a systemic phenomenon, in which the key place is occupied by the phenomenon of state rebellion, when regions and local authorities begin to openly confront Washington, demonstrating a desire to change the status quo and protect their own interests. Causes of protests: multi-level social and political tensions. The roots of the current unrest go far back in the past, but several key factors provoked an avalanche-like development of events. 1. Economic inequality and the crisis of the middle class. Since the end of the 20th century, the United States has faced a growing gap between rich and poor. Economic growth has predominantly benefited the upper crust, while the middle class has gradually shrunk. This is especially noticeable in regions with declining industry and agriculture, the Midwest, the South, and parts of the Northeast. Economic instability has generated discontent among large sections of the population, who do not see prospects for themselves and feel that their voice is not taken into account by politicians. 2. Racial and cultural conflicts. Racial inequality is one of the key reasons for the protests. Cases of police brutality against African Americans and representatives of other minorities have caused a wave of indignation and protests across the country. The Black Lives Matter movement has become a symbol of the fight against systemic racism. In addition to racial issues, cultural conflicts between conservative and liberal groups have intensified in society, which manifest themselves in disputes over LGBT+ rights, migration, education, and freedom of speech. 3. Political polarization and a crisis of trust in institutions. Today, U.S. parties represent diametrically opposed views, which complicates compromises and leads to a political blockade. The growth of disinformation and manipulation in the media and social networks reduces trust in elections and the government as a whole. The growing influence of radical groups and the emergence of armed formations on the side of the protests adds danger and increases the risk of violence. The dynamics of protests, from local actions to a large-scale movement. Local features of protests. Each state has its own characteristics. California is the center of liberal movements, where protests are often peaceful, but are also marked by large actions for the rights of migrants and climate initiatives. Texas is one of the epicenters of the confrontation between the federal government and the active movement for state rights, with toughening laws against demonstrators and migrants. Florida, here protests are combined with attempts by the local government to limit the influence of opposition forces and strengthen control over the media. The Midwest, regions with economic problems and high unemployment, where protests acquire economic and social overtones. Scale and intensity. Over the past 2 years, the protests have grown from local events to a national movement with tens of thousands of participants. In some cities, the protests lasted for weeks, with both peaceful marches and clashes with the police. In some cases, local authorities failed to cope with the situation, forcing them to deploy the National Guard and even consider a state of emergency. State rebellion, symptoms of a federal crisis. Aggravation of relations between states and the federal center. State rebellion manifests itself in a series of political decisions and acts of disobedience to the federal government. Local authorities introduce their own laws, often opposing them to federal ones. This is especially evident in issues of migration, gun control, environmental policy, and social support. A number of states are voting on expanding autonomy, and some politicians are calling for a revision of the federal structure. Conflicts and divisions in society. Differences in political views between states lead to the formation of almost autonomous political islands, which exacerbates social division. This is also reflected in the media space. Different states receive completely different information, which further increases polarization.
The impact of social networks and media. Modern technologies have become a catalyst for protests, allowing people to quickly mobilize and disseminate information. But at the same time, they contribute to the spread of fakes, fear-mongering, and radicalization. The role of disinformation. The overwhelming majority of news about protests is distributed through social networks, where algorithms often amplify extreme opinions and provocations. This leads to the emergence of parallel realities, where supporters and opponents of protests live in different information worlds. Activation of civil society. On the other hand, social networks have given a voice to those who previously remained invisible, helped organize volunteer and educational initiatives, which has a positive effect on the level of consciousness of the population. The impact of the pandemic and the economic factor. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the crisis of trust in the authorities, demonstrated the weakness of social protection, and led to mass unemployment, which has become an additional catalyst for protests. Many groups have been hit hardest: low-wage workers, minorities, people without health insurance, and this has increased social tensions. Risks and prospects for conflict development. Possibility of escalation of violence. The growing standoff between protesters and authorities could lead to serious clashes, increased radicalism, and even the formation of armed groups. Political and economic consequences. If the crisis drags on, it will negatively affect the investment climate, social stability, and the international image of the United States as a unified power. Hopes for dialogue and reform. Optimistic scenarios suggest intensifying political dialogue, reforming the police, improving social protection, and overcoming divisions. Social and political consequences. Mass protests and the state revolt have already had a serious impact on the socio-political situation in the United States. At the local level, reforms have begun in the law enforcement system, and attention has increased to issues of racial and economic justice. However, at the federal level, the crisis of trust continues to mount, which complicates the adoption of important laws and reforms. The economy has not been left out either. In some regions, protests and uncertainty have led to a decrease in investment, a slowdown in business development, and an outflow of qualified personnel. Political polarization is worsening, which creates the risk of further destabilization and even the threat of serious internal conflict. What's next? An unpredictable future. In conditions of growing instability, much depends on whether federal and local authorities can find a compromise and begin a constructive dialogue. The role of civil society and new leaders who are able to unite different segments of the population is also important. However, it is already clear today. The protests and the state uprising are not a temporary phenomenon, but a symptom of deep systemic problems that require decisive action. If you want to know how these events can affect the future of the United States and the whole world, stay tuned. In the following videos, we will analyze in detail the development of the conflict, key figures, and unexpected turns of events. Backhand index pointing right, don't forget to subscribe and like so as not to miss the latest and most important news.